Feminism is a social-political movement with, of course, many definitions. Some scholars describe it as a movement aimed at the equality of men and women. Bell Hooks defines it as aimed at eliminating sexism and oppression, and others even include any kind of social-political activism in which women partake. The history of the feminist movement is typically divided into 3 to 4 waves. Today, I want to look at problems with the way these are classified, and what they have to do with white privilege. First, I will talk a bit about what so-called waves of a social movement even are. The idea to classify feminism in different peaks of mobilization has been used since the 1960s. It divided feminism into different phases that share common goals, political events, and/or ideological similarities. In contrast to times where feminist ideas existed but were not part of a public social movement, the waves describe episodes where women consciously and tactically organized themselves to fight for gender equality. In the following, I will lay out the way that these 4 waves of feminism are typically described and characterized. What are common features attributed to them, what events are they centered around, and what might be some problems within the movements. These depictions are not ones that you find in simplified non-scientific media, but in actual and contemporary scientific literature. I'm saying this to stress the degree to which this way of describing the feminist movement is normalized and accepted. Then, I will paint a different picture, include other voices, and criticize not only dynamics within the movement of feminism, but even within the way it is historicized. I will talk about racism within the feminist movement and academia, the usefulness of the wave metaphor, and intersectionality. So let's talk about the 3.5 waves of feminism in the way that we are usually taught that they happened. Not meaning to sound like a conspiracy theorist. The first wave of feminism is generally described to range from the mid-19th century to the first half of the 20th. It is the wave that is most closely tied to a specific, unified goal and political events. The Seneca Falls Declaration, held in 1848, was the first women's rights convention in the US. 300 people gathered to talk about how women experienced discrimination in their lack of property rights, education, and, importantly, their non-existing suffrage. This event is seen as the groundwork for the mobilization of many groups and organizations which came together under the goal of achieving women's right to vote. Parallel events happened in European countries, for instance in Great Britain in 1866. Another important topic of the first wave was the financial dependence of women on the men around them. Legally speaking, women were completely controlled by their fathers and later their husbands, having no rights over their possessions or even their children. Changing these 2 conditions were the main demands first-wave feminists had. So, if the ideas were there since way into the 19th century, why did it take until the 1910s and 1920s that women achieved suffrage in the US, the UK, Germany, and other European and non-European countries? As Patricia Farr describes in a paper on women's suffrage and World War I, it is a common idea to relate this development to the war. The narrative is that because of the changed material conditions, women had more bargaining power compared to before the war. So, during the war, a lot of men were not at home and providing for their family, as in an average middle-class white household at that time. A lot of women therefore entered the workforce and experienced the emancipation of doing the exact work that was said to be impossible or at least not suitable for them. Since women were therefore more present in public life, they could also unionize more and organize in bigger groups, leading to more pressure on the government. It is really interesting to look at this, and it strengthens my opinion on social movements being so heavily related to the material and political conditions of a society, and sadly far less to whether these ideas that they spread are good and helpful or not. If this topic interests you, I recommend the podcast What is Politics, that discusses the importance of material conditions for political change in a very interesting episode. It's a great podcast in general. So, the idea behind this change is that with the introduction of many women into the workforce due to World War I, the mobilization and emancipation of women increased. This is why so many countries finally granted women suffrage after World War I, and others after World War II. Some even say that this is a reason for why Swiss women only achieved suffrage in 1971, since they did not experience the same change in material conditions as the women in the US and the UK, for instance. However, we will see later what lies behind the idea that the situation during the World Wars enabled women's fight for suffrage. In a sort of cliffhanger way, you could say that it is one of the lies I want to uncover in this episode. Okay, a few more words about first wave feminism. Since it had a very unified and clear goal, its public presence then declined after women's suffrage was reached. That is why some scholars even debate the idea of whether the first wave was feminist in the sense that we mean the word today, or just a movement for women's right to vote. What they mean is that oftentimes it did not yet incorporate any of the ideas of actual equality that were later included in the feminist movement. Also, it is important to mention that the usual depiction of the first wave is centered around white women in the US, as you might have already noticed. As I said, I'm currently describing how the history of feminism is commonly depicted. Bear with me. The second wave of feminism lasted roughly from the 1960s to the 1980s. It is impossible to talk about the second wave without mentioning two revolutionary literary/academic works that influenced and shaped it. First, I think I can't even say the name of this work here, but Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex from 1949. This is one of the most influential and important feminist works to this day. In it, with the iconic sentence, "One is not born a woman but becomes one," de Beauvoir lays the groundwork for so much of feminist, queer, and gender theory that is talked about today. It basically presents the idea of how masculinity has been treated as the default, to which femininity is the deviant other. Flashback to last episode on Orientalism. By positioning men as the self, women are put into the position of an object, and the whole essence of the female existence becomes a projection of male fantasy. This ranges from the use of male-centered language to the political disadvantages of women. To give a contemporary example, it is also reason for the huge lack of medical knowledge about women, since so many medical studies have only been tested on men as the default humans, leading to literal deaths of women all over the world. The second important work is called The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. It brings up sexism in the education, reproductive rights, and workplace inequality. It has a big focus on the dissatisfaction of American housewives, with their role of always putting others first and themselves last, as a mother and as a wife. Both of these works gave space to problems that so many women were already feeling, but before did not have the language to express. The second wave is the mobilization of the fight against these problems in bigger groups and in various areas of public life. The main focus of the second wave are issues in reproductive rights, sexuality, economic exploitation, and domestic violence against women. I should just stop trying not to use any restricted words at this point. These issues were voiced and discussed under two big catchphrases. Firstly, the personal is political, and secondly, sisterhood is powerful. Behind these phrases lie various important ideas. The concept behind the first one is that the political oppression of women is not only visible in the workplace discrimination or lack of political representation, but in every single aspect of personal life as well. In the relationships at home, in the family dynamics, in the self-esteem and body image of women, and basically any other aspect of identity that you can think of. The second phrase, sisterhood is powerful, is basically the 1970s version of being a girl's girl. It describes the idea of being united in the fight for equality, instead of buying the idea of the patriarchal competition among women. It also assumes that all women are equal and united in their activism against the patriarchy. Second wave feminism was way more heterogeneous than the first wave. Different subgroups emerged, connected to other social movements happening at the time, like the anti-Vietnam War protests, the civil rights movement, and some LGBTQ activism. One of these subgroups is radical feminism, which does not mean the description that anti-feminists used to describe people fighting for equality as radical in a bad way, but is actually a subsection of feminism. The radical feminist perspective polarizes especially in the aspect of seeing most of the beauty and adult entertainment industry as inherently sexist, which then of course creates opposition. For many, the second wave came to an end due to inner disagreement about topics like this. The question is kind of to what degree the phrase "the personal is political" is supposed to be lived, and how feminists choose to evaluate dilemmas for women between their personal feminist values and their problems to realize and live these in every aspect of their life. Therefore, during the 80s, the second wave kind of fell apart from within. and gave place to the third wave feminism in a harmonious and unambiguous way, just how history always works. Third wave feminism is in many ways the daughter of second wave feminism. Depending on the source, the third wave either lasted from the 1990s to the 2010s, or it is the wave that we are currently living in. Many third wave activists had mothers that were active in the second wave. Even the writer and activist Rebecca Walker, which the declaration of the third wave is attributed to, is the daughter of second wave activist Alice Walker. The third wave is all about the girls. It is about reclaiming, redefining, and opening up the idea of what feminism can be. The concept of what a girl is was reclaimed from a small, weak person to an empowered, cool, independent being. This is very visible in the music industry and the shift from seeing femininity as the product of male fantasy towards celebrating and displaying it. It is a feminism more focused on individuals and finally more willing to include principles of intersectionality. There is more of an attempt to include women of color and voices from the global south, but also people on other axes of discrimination like class, ableism, homophobia, etc. In theory, the topics of the third wave are very similar to the ones of the second one, namely reproductive rights, body image, more educational equality, and domestic violence. Also, media representation of women was and is an important topic. The third wave openly criticizes a lot of the ideas of the second one, often even adapting the narrative of anti-feminist media during that time. Second wavers were described as all ugly, all lesbian, all unfeminine women by the media, but also in many cases by the third wave. Therefore, the third wave defined itself with the celebration of being beautiful, not rejecting the beauty industry and not trying to move away from what is seen as feminine in society. In a simplified way, you could say that the second wave is about criticizing how we can find the male gaze in almost every aspect of what makes up femininity and getting rid of this, while the third wave celebrates that very femininity. The Spice Girls are a very good example of this vibe. By the way, if you're wondering, of course feminism was at all times presented as ridiculous and problematic in the media, also because there was, especially during the first wave, a massive lack of representation of women in any of the media industries. It's also not surprising though. So, because the second wave was kind of shattered from within over some ideological questions of radicality, the third wave embraces a very non-judgmental attitude towards all choices women make, choice feminism. I originally wanted to include a discussion on choice feminism in this episode when I still thought the history of feminism can sort of be told through the four waves, but here we are now, and I definitely have to put that topic in a different episode. Just for a small teaser though, I'm not a fan. Briefly, choice feminism celebrates all choices women consciously make as feminists, since the ability to make a free choice is the ultimate goal of feminism, in their view. The third wave seeks to get rid of all the perceived ideological rigidity of feminism and opens the concept up. Then, in the 2010s, something happened. Yeah, so what I mean is the rise of social media. Media are a crucial tool for organizing groups and spreading information, and also giving people access to a language and space for their experiences. That is the main reason why many scholars consider the time after the 2010s as a fourth wave of feminism, due to its changed tools of mass mobilization. Awareness campaigns like #MeToo are exemplary for the change that social media has made in the feminist movement. Interestingly, within the fourth wave, we can find ideas of all the different waves at the same time. You can follow third wave girl boss activists and second wave radical feminists, POC feminism and LGBTQ groups, all within our phones. In my own opinion, another important attribute of the fourth wave is the increased catering of the feminist movement to men. The idea that by eliminating the patriarchy, we not only improve the living conditions of women, but also develop better mental health and social relations for men who suffer from the pressure of toxic masculinity. Within the first wave, it was actually really normal for men to participate in the fight for women's suffrage, not only in the US, but also, for instance, in Lebanese first wave feminism. In some ways, this idea got more complicated with the rise of intersectionality being skewed into identity politics, and some feminist groups now not even allowing men in their spaces, with the idea of creating safe spaces for women. Again, I'm not a fan of this, and I support every male feminist out there as well as every female one, if they fight for a good thing in a good way. Anyway, I found it interesting to mention this idea, but I'm happy to be corrected in case this idea of talking about the problems of men in the patriarchy was already talked about before within feminism. Other than that, it is still very hard to give defining traits to the fourth wave, as we are currently living in it and still don't know where it will lead us. That is why some scholars do not see the fourth wave as a new one, since it doesn't yet have any major ideological differences to the third one. The main change is about the medium that feminism is conducted in. And with this, the story of the four waves comes to an end for now. This description, in some way or another, is easily found within academic literature all over the world. It is not an entirely bad way to describe the movement, but it is also far from being an unambiguous truth. What I want to do now is discuss whether this story is useful and what some problems with it are. First, let's go back to the connection of women's suffrage and World War I, since I'm sure no one can live with that cliffhanger for even a minute longer. As I said, a common conception is that the war enabled many or most women to enter the workforce and partake in public life. British suffragettes like Millicent Fawcett even declared at the time that the war, quote-unquote, freed women. However, another perspective is given by Patricia Farah, who takes a closer look at which women even profited from this change in the UK. First, and I will come back to this later in detail, it is obviously a very white middle-class perspective, since many women of color and lower-class women had always been part of the workforce out of economic necessity. Second, as Farah describes, only a very small portion of more privileged women were actually introduced into jobs with good working conditions. Most were working tedious or dangerous jobs, often in the war machinery industry. Also, a lot of this development was not due to the war, but due to technological advances and the invention of the typewriter, for example. This, in combination with men returning after the war, led to women being delegated to the position of secretaries, again introducing the prior discriminatory order. Men were the ones using the new technologies for intellectual advances, while women were kept down and paid little for transferring note, etc. It is too simplified to talk about the war as the only cause, and indeed, the technological and scientific advances strengthened and seemingly legitimized the social order, leading to a return to the traditional roles after the war ended. This social Darwinism was even used to fight against suffragettes' demands for the right to vote. That's partly why, when the right to vote was finally granted, it only included women over 30 in the UK, and the structural changes improving women's overall living conditions were very far. In the common description of the first wave, it seems as if the right to vote was gained and suffragettes were content with this and stopped fighting. In reality, at least in the UK, women were still second-class citizens with little influence, and the discrimination in the workforce was not eliminated with the right to vote, since all positions of power were still taken up by men. So what happened after that? According to the wave metaphor, nothing happened. Women just stopped fighting until at least 30 years later. With feminist journalist Cicely Hamilton saying about the feminist movement at that time, quote, "The battle we had thought won is going badly against us," unquote, I don't think that they stopped. In fact, what is obscured in the gap between the first and second wave is that women laid significant strategic groundwork for the things to come. Women in the US and Europe started to put forward feminist demands within unions, trying to achieve equal pay for equal work. Thereby, they made connections with people in leadership positions and obviously fought against a lot of resistance. Only through these connections was the later activism in the second wave even possible. In the same way, what is also often forgotten, the first wave did not emerge out of nowhere either. So-called proto-feminists like Mary Wollstonecraft and Christine de Pizan wrote influential works that constitute the theoretical base for a lot of activism. However, they also followed Enlightenment principles of a person's value being an inborn attribute only given to some people. This idea is crucially connected to my biggest criticism of the wave metaphor, which I will talk about now. The idea that value is inborn into every human being is beautiful. It is far less beautiful if any kind of hierarchy is introduced and this philosophy is used against certain groups. This is exactly what happened within the US and European society at that time, and therefore also within the feminist movement. It shaped the first wave massively, and its influence proceeded into all the other waves in a more hidden way. Okay, so where do I start? The thing is not only that the first wave did not include women of color in their activism or have a white perspective, it's that some suffragists actively used racist ideology for advancing their fight for suffrage. They positioned themselves as higher than people of color and argued for their right to vote based on being white. This, in some way, helped them get a voice in the political discourse, through active discrimination of women of color. The most horrible aspect is that because of this marginalization, it became an accepted idea that women of color were not even significantly present within the suffragette movement. The discrimination reached so far as to positioning white feminism as the only existing activism for women's rights. Scholars researching that time period had to dig deep to find out how many women of color were actually active within the movement and within their own groups, since the media only ever included white women. Women of color were often fighting at multiple fronts, being discriminated in each of them either for being a woman or for not being white. This was actually already criticized in 1851 by black female activists as an ideological inconsistency. So the Instagram post that we see about including more diverse voices in the movement is not at all a new idea. This suppression of the women of color feminism is just as important during the second wave. Again, the common way to talk about it is saying that, yeah, sadly, there was a lot of discrimination, so there weren't many non-white women in the movement. In reality, many of the earliest feminist organizations of the second wave were Chicana groups, Asian American and black activists. During the second wave, women of color developed the ideas that are often now accredited to the third wave. They pointed out racism in the movement, showing how it was always catering to white women's experiences. Even the fundamental work, The Feminine Mystique, which I mentioned before, spoke out of a very white middle-class perspective about housewives, an experience extremely different from women of color's living situations. Asian American feminists established grassroots networks with countries in the global south to include more voices and start international cooperation. Many of the genius writings produced in the second wave about intersectionality and feminist theory are claimed by the third wave now to enhance the self-perception of the third wave as more diverse. What second wave women of color were especially criticizing is how exclusionary the slogan "Sisterhood is powerful" can be. This nice parole, meant in a supportive way, actually ignored all the other axes of discrimination women can experience and makes it seem like all women are already equal as sisters. In fact, white women within the movement failed and often still fail to recognize how they are not only part of an oppressed group due to being a woman, but simultaneously part of an oppressing and privileged group. By not acknowledging this, we fail to realize how we participate in upholding the system of racism, as was laid out by the POC feminists in the second wave. For instance, the idea of second wave feminists to look at important women in history, writing a new, more feminist herstory, also failed to acknowledge the colonial and imperial structures inherent to this past, as Pamela Baruti points out. I'm trying to use mostly paraphrased words of these women here. Also, they argue that the slogan, "the personal is political," only works if the concept of the personal is extended to experiences beyond their own privileged group and includes experiences from women of color, lower-class women, lesbians, or disabled feminists. Important works in the context of racial discrimination in feminism are bell hooks' Ain't I a Woman?, Black Women and Feminism, the anthology This Bridge Called My Back, and works by Audre Lorde. So, ideas of intersectionality and multi-layered approaches to the concept of identity emerged. However, they were not really credited in white circles at that time, and the second wave was seen as mostly executed by white women. Crucially, that became part of the self-perception of the third wavers. The third wave criticized this white bias within feminism in the past and positioned itself as a new, inclusive, intersectional feminism. By doing so, it often appropriated works of second-wave women of color and presented itself as superior to past movements. However, the third wave itself was and is still very white-focused. Women of color like Pamela Baruti experience frustration when entering feminist circles, as they are still mostly catering to the experiences lived within white privilege groups. The goal of intersectionality is fighting against the resistance of privileged groups to recognize themselves as privileged, in the same way some men cannot accept their gendered privilege as well. In a world where this critique became impossible to ignore, the third and fourth wave openly address it, but often do not realize it in practice. Power dynamics lead to discrimination even within the current wave or state of feminism. Now, in theory, almost everybody can have a voice in the public discourse, and social media decentralized power monopolies. In reality, however, the structures upholding discrimination just became more and more hidden over time. Now they're present in the positions of power in the media industry that still are nowhere near representing a cross-section of society. Third-wave feminism shields itself from such criticism, as it makes diversity its self-image and rejects most rigid claims in general. With all this being said, it is shocking how silenced the voices of POC feminists were and are. Describing the four waves, as I did in the beginning, makes a specific white European and US American feminism seem as the norm and totality of what feminism is. In this episode, I did not even get into feminist movements in the global south, since I wanted to criticize the wave metaphor from within the countries it is used for. But, of course, it is also crucial to state that this is not the history of feminism, but one from a certain perspective. When I started researching this episode, I thought I was probably going to conclude with a middle way, saying that the wave metaphor is useful but simplifies the history, of course. Now, after seeing how much the work of women in unions, proto-feminists, and especially POC women in the movement had been obscured, I don't think I can still accept this middle ground as an answer. I think it is absurd how this story became the norm, leaving out all these women fighting for feminism in different ways. It is in fact alarming how much I learned when reading more sources, since it makes me think about how many other marginalized groups we leave out in the way that we talk about history and politics, thinking that we are being more or less objective. Power hierarchies and discrimination infiltrate every single aspect of our world, from governments to the way history books are written, to the way that we conduct science. The way in which I do think we can use the wave metaphor is in an ahistoric approach. Especially second versus third wave present two interesting theoretical attitudes toward feminism, so the distinction can be used to classify if a scholar or activist is more leaning towards radical feminism or choice feminism, for instance. Guess which one I prefer. I am so thankful to have taken this time to look closer and read the words of marginalized women, and I hope to include this knowledge in my own life as a very privileged feminist. Thank you for listening.